It is my hope that you're following the series of conversations that I started about the continent of Africa. We covered three countries already in a previous episode, and so for this episode, we're covering two. The focus will be Zimbabwe and South Africa. And giving us the information about Zimbabwe and South Africa is Rene. Rene is also in Colombia, like the others who joined me in the previous conversations. And the thing that's so great about it is, again, the first person accounts about what life was like in Zimbabwe and South Africa and the comparisons of being in other places and how valuable they see their experience starting off in the continent of Africa. So with that being said, open your ears and let's go. And today on Voices, I am excited to continue the series about the continent, specifically the continent Africa, second biggest continent in the world. Definitely one of the most diverse continents in the world, but one that probably is the least known about. So I feel that because I've been blessed in my life to know people from the continent, that we should have conversations that are public so people can know more about the continent of Africa. No more excuses of it being the dark continent. That's historic. We live in a modern world where the light is available everywhere. Today, joining me is a very, very good friend. I had the privilege of getting to know her a couple of years ago, and she's given me some really, really just great stories with her and all her friends, and just learning things about life and culture. And so, joining me today is Rene. And Rene is an awesome, awesome English teacher, but she's going to give us some information specifically about where she's from in the continent. So no person can introduce themselves better than themselves. So welcome, thank you, and the floor is yours, Rene.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. My name is Rene, and I'm African. I am a white African, born and bred in Africa. I was born in Zimbabwe and lived there for many, many years, but I also had the privilege of living in South Africa. So I am home to two countries from Africa, and I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit about each one with you today.
And you know what's so awesome is that, and I mentioned this in another podcast with people I talked about the continent, is that we met in South America, in Colombia. And if we go back to the Pangea model, Africa, the continent, and South America, the continent, were once connected. So it's almost like you're kind of sort of home, right? Because they all were one thing if we believe the history of the world and the Pangea. So
True.
it's cool, and it's almost natural to be here, right? Especially since there is African influence in this country.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that I want to start with is, so you said you were from Zimbabwe, but you also lived in South Africa. So what is one thing that you would say that makes Zimbabwe and even South Africa, if you can think of one, a great place? One thing that you're like, if you go to this place, this is what you'll love about it. So what do you think would be like one thing?
Well, each one is different in its own, but then they also have a lot of similarities. So Zimbabwe is more, I would say it's a lot smaller. And right now it's a very poor country, whereas once it was the breadbasket of Africa. And one would actually not ever think that it was because of how it is right now. But it's such a beautiful country. And I mean, each one, actually, Zimbabwe and South Africa are known for their landscape and their wildlife. So a lot of tourists that I feel like when they travel to either South Africa or Zimbabwe, I think that the animals and the wildlife and the nature and the landscape is definitely an attraction for the tourism.
And you know, you mentioned tourism, so and again, both of us are in South America, and so there was obviously sort of a language issue. Like I remember saying to myself, I would never come to South America, and I think it was sort of a fear of language, right? While I studied languages in university because it's required, the Spanish thing, I don't know what was my issue was earlier, and then it just became an issue. So languages, so like what languages, well, one that you speak, but that are spoken in specifically Zimbabwe and South Africa, are they different? Are they kind of close? What's the deal with languages there?
Well, I mean, they each have their languages, their like national languages. South Africa actually has 11 languages. So what happens is that basically in each province, a different language is spoken. So depending where you come from in South Africa, they speak a different language. So even though I would say most people in South Africa speak English, it is actually not the most popular language.
Wow.
It's not, no, it's actually not the most spoken language. I think it's the second. And in Zimbabwe, obviously they speak English as well, but then they speak another language called Shona. And I think most of the African languages, even though they sound a lot different, there are similarities. One that is very different though is, it comes from South Africa and it's in the Eastern Cape and it's called Xhosa. And Xhosa has like 3 different clicks in it, and it's really difficult to like try and like pronunciate the words, but it's also really interesting to listen to the people when they're actually speaking it.
Wow. So
to answer your question about that, about the languages and what languages I speak. So I speak English. English is my first language, but my home language is actually Afrikaans.
And so a question, right? So if I were to come to Zimbabwe or South Africa, what would a greeting be like? Maybe in English and in Afrikaans in the different nations. Like, how would I say hello? For instance, I was in China and I learned ni hao and then ni hao ma, right? So I understand that. But so how would I greet someone? Because I think that's the warmest way to kind of say I acknowledge that I am in your space.
Well, like I said, most people speak English, so you would probably say hi in English, although Zulu is one of the most spoken languages. So if you want to say hi in Zulu, sawubona, you could say sawubona to people, like in Zulu, to say hello. But then again, it also depends which region you're in. So for example, if you go to the supermarket, depending where you're at, you would hear like people speaking different languages. So if you are familiar with the language that they're speaking, you would realize, which language they're speaking, and you would greet them in that language. Okay, so for example, Pretoria, the capital city of South Africa, there's Afrikaans is very spoken in that city. So if you go into the supermarkets, you might hear people speaking Afrikaans, so you would greet them in Afrikaans. If you how to greet them.
Go ahead. And so how would you do that? How would you greet someone in Afrikaans?
Well, I mean, I would say good morning or good afternoon and say like, how are you? So for example, goeiemôre, hoe gaan dit?
Cool. Now, the funny thing is, if I never knew anything, which I don't really, while I know a couple of language, that sounds a little Arabic to me. That sounds a little Arabic, but I don't know.
They call Afrikaans kitchen Dutch.
Oh wow! Okay.
The nickname that they give Afrikaans is kitchen Dutch.
Well, that's cool. I think that's pretty cool. So, so with this sort of the idea of Africa, the continent, and now you being in Colombia, what inspired you to come to Colombia? Like, have you seen similarities or differences in the space of being here in the time you've been here compared to home?
Well, I feel like every country you go to, you kind of compare the cultures to your own culture. And what's amazing is how many similarities there are actually. I mean, I lived in Korea for 3 years, and in the Korean culture, there are so many similarities with many of the African cultures and the gestures. So it was to me, it was mind blowing because who would imagine that, like in Korea and in South Africa, there would be so many similarities with, for example, the cultures. So in Colombia as well, there are a lot of differences, but then there's also some similarities. Coming here, though, I came here as a volunteer. I was looking for a country that was in need of English teachers. So I came here as a volunteer, and then I really liked Colombia, and I wanted to get to know Colombia better and the culture and experience it a little bit more. So I continued. So here I am still almost 4 years later.
So what's the most appealing part? Like, for instance, for me, I'm an American, and I at one point was more closed-minded than I am. I'm not saying Americans are closed-minded, but I'm saying I was more closed-minded than I thought. And then once I had the opportunity to kind of explore the world, while I am still American in my heart and in many of my actions, I see the value of other cultures and ways and mannerisms. But the thing I thought about was I only came here for 6 months. And then I decided to stay a little longer. And the reason I wanted to is because I felt like it was unfinished business. A friend of mine said he stayed here because he never got bored, which means there was always something new. And so for you, what is probably the most appealing part of the country as far as being here in Colombia?
Well, to be honest, the first 6 months that I was here as a volunteer, in the beginning, I didn't have any intentions of staying any longer. So I tried to travel as much as possible within those first 6 months, but then I decided to stay on. So I didn't travel as much afterwards, but I don't know. I think it was just, as a teacher, I enjoy getting to know different schools and different cultures and the students, and how the schools operate as well. It's really interesting to see the differences that they have, and to learn from the students as well with regards to the curriculums and how they see things and react to things. So I think it's kind of like I was curious. I'm still curious about the country, I guess.
Yeah, and so do you think the curiosity about your home, or just the sort of the stability that home is home, makes you feel, and I'm just talking about it, this is from my perspective, makes you feel that home will always be there. And so I want to explore this place that has my attention for as long as I feel it has my attention. Is that something similar to how you would feel? Or maybe describe it.
I would say yes and no, only because I agree with you. Home is always there. I mean, home does call, and I am really excited to go back home one day. But right now, I feel like Colombia is the best place for me in my life. How can I say? So, as a teacher, for example, going back home, teachers are not very well paid, and as an international teacher here, I have a lot more opportunities. So to be an international teacher in South Africa, for example, I won't have the same benefit because I'd be a local. However, here, because I'm not a local, there's a lot more benefits. So as far as work goes, right now where I am is really good for me.
All right, now I understand that. So if you mentioned exploring Colombia, like in those first 6 months, because I had that same sort of mentality. We went on some adventures together where I met you guys in places, yes. And we explored. But what if someone was gonna go to Zimbabwe or South Africa, what are some places that they may feel a pull to go explore and see?
Well, Zimbabwe, I mean, it has one of the seven wonders of the world. It has Victoria Falls, and it's absolutely beautiful. It's breathtaking. So you can't go to Zimbabwe and not go to Victoria Falls. It's amazing. But then as well, Zimbabwe has one of the biggest man-made lakes in the world, and it's beautiful. It's called Kariba Dam. So, and again, they have the wildlife, I guess, as well. In South Africa, they've got Cape Town, which is which is stunning, and it's a hot place for all tourists to go. But then they also have the diversity in landscape. If you're looking for, ocean or mountains, or you're looking for the Karoo, if you're looking for animals or for city life, it's so diverse in that way as well. So I feel like there's so much actually to see. Obviously, in South Africa, there's probably more to see, being that it is a bigger country.
Yeah, the thing is, and this is interesting. And I remember when the film Black Panther came out, right? Obviously created by Marvel and Stan Lee, and I can't remember. I think it's Jack Kirby who created it. And I remember they created that comic book for during the Black Panther movement in the United States, and there was this huge push about knowing. Again, another push, because there were several pushes in the United States about knowing the continent of Africa. And obviously they made up a fictional country called Wakanda, and then they empowered the person with resources that they hid from the outside world. And so I look at that, and I've always wondered, uh, is 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 it fair? I'm trying to think of how I want to word this, because I feel like is it fair in what your perception is, or what you know of what Americans, specifically, I would say Black Americans, perceive of the continent, and maybe your countries of Zimbabwe and South Africa. Is it fair? Some of the perceptions that you've heard, and I don't mean it as a judgment call, but I mean it is what you know, and do you wonder why they have some of those sort of impressions or perceptions about the nations?
Well, I feel like, aren't we all a little bit ignorant about any place until we go there?
Yeah,
So, I mean, you could be really well read up about a place, or have watched a lot of documentaries to get a better feel of a place. And I mean, sometimes some tourists know more about my country than even I do, because they go there looking for certain things and to explore. Whereas when you live in a place, sometimes, because everything is in your backyard, you really don't actually take advantage of where you're living. So, about what like certain Americans would think of the country or about the continent as well, I guess it's kind of like, what do you see on TV as well? What does the media portray? Like, how do they explain the continent, or what's happening in the continent, or anything as well? It's kind of like, everyone has this idea of how it is to live in America. You watch movies and you're like, oh, like this movie, this is what it's like in America. I want to go to America. That's a place to be. But then, some people in America might be like, but that's actually not what America is really like. And I think it's the same thing for a lot of Africans as well. Still today, when I get into a taxi in Colombia, the taxi driver will be friendly, and he'll ask me, like, am I from America? And I would say no. And he would ask me where I was from, and I was from South Africa. And he would literally like turn around and he'd be like, but you're white. Like, yes, there are white people in Africa, and they're just absolutely like amazed by the fact that there's actually white people in Africa. And again, like I said, I feel like everyone is ignorant to a certain place unless you actually go there. So some more than others. Like some might have access to more books or more articles or more videos about the different countries in Africa,
Right. You know what's interesting, and I'm going to ask you something about Colombia in just a second, but you made me think of it. I get on YouTube because I have a smattering. My YouTube algorithm is confused. It doesn't know what I like. But I was watching a video. I seldom watch these videos, but I was watching a video of a person describing Colombia, right? And they were American. And I could literally hear, especially since I actually knew a lot of the places they were talking about, I could hear the bias in what they're saying. And I could also recognize how they left out certain things because either they willfully didn't know it, or they knew it and just wanted to ignore it. And it was just so amazing because it's weird about just how people choose to convey messages back to their home or to the public using their bias. And so I said all that to say, I wanted to know, what are some things about Colombia that you think would be great or could possibly benefit it if they were implemented in Zimbabwe or South Africa, and vice versa? What are some things that could be implemented or tried socially, economically, whatever the dynamic you choose, from Zimbabwe and South Africa that could be in Colombia that could help? Because I think it's less Western in the ideology there. So I'm always curious about like what things would exchange to improve both societies in an opinion based answer, obviously.
Yeah. Well, one thing I must say, especially from living in the coastal region in Colombia, is that people here just seem really happy. Like they're such joyful people. And South Africans have more of a negativity about them. Like, I think South Africans are more, I don't know. I feel like sometimes the way of their thinking is more negative than it is positive. So I think that would be a really nice thing to take over to South Africa, is to bring a little bit more positivity back, to bring some of the joy that they have here, you know, in there, to have it there. So that to me is a big thing, actually, is because everywhere you go, you want, you know, it's when you see happy people and people having a good time, then you yourself just feel better about yourself as well and who you are and where you're at. Whereas when you're around people who are very negative, or they, you know, they have a negative outlook on life, or like their perspective is not as positive, it's a little bit of a downer. So, you know, it brings you down as well.
Oh yeah, I totally get that. No, I totally get that.
Yeah.
No, I totally get that.
Look, Zimbabwean people are one of the friendliest, like, it's one of the friendliest countries. I think the people that come from Zimbabwe are super friendly. South Africans are known to be a little bit friendly as well. Some people have said that they're super friendly, but then I think living there and being a tourist there are also two different things. I guess in any country that you go to, being a tourist there and actually being a resident are like two different things. And that's what's really interesting about being in Colombia right now, is that at first, yeah, I came as a tourist, as a volunteer tourist, but now I'm actually living here. So, you know, your way of life is a little bit different compared to what it was in the beginning.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with that. And so for that, like, thinking about your time here, thinking about your time at home, that what are some of the most memorable moments you have in those places, like that you're like, someone would definitely love this country if they knew about this moment that I had in X place? So like your most memorable moment in Colombia and your most memorable moment in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, like, hey, these things are so awesome that you just, this is why you should know this country. Do you have any of those?
Well, I mean, one of the things, like, I'm going to say it again, is just that the experience I've had with people here is that they're so friendly. You know, here they invite you into their house and it's like, you know, mi casa, su casa, like literally they would sit you down and feed you, and, you know, there's no limits to them trying to like please you and make you happy as well. I don't know, there's like a vibe about it, which is really captivating, and it makes you feel good too. In both South Africa and Zimbabwe, it's a little bit different because I feel like when I was younger, growing up, things were a lot different. So, for example, I grew up in Zimbabwe, and my family, we were farmers, and I grew up on a farm with my two sisters, and it was an amazing life. Like, as a mom, I would love to be able to give my child that and have her grow up the way that I did, but it's not a possibility. So I would say that my childhood was amazing. Growing up on a farm, like, you know, being able to get on my bicycle and just like cycle down to like the farm dam, for example, and go swimming there, or, you know, just the freedom that I would have living on a farm. Neighbors were far apart, but, you know, it was great. It was like the farming community was really nice. It was a good life. So that to me is always the special thing about growing up in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has a special place in my heart because I feel like as a country, it's been through so much. Like I mentioned before, it used to be the breadbasket of Africa, and now it's the complete opposite, unfortunately. But, you know, Zimbabwe was always really known for its agriculture and its minerals. And it's really sad to see what the country is like now. And that's why I eventually ended up in South Africa, which as well, South Africa is great. And even though they're neighboring countries, they're so different in their own ways.
It's amazing because I would even, while it's not an equal, I can understand in the sense where you have the United States is next to Canada and Mexico, or that Colombia is sort of, even though in the grand Colombia history, right, you have Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama, and how the differences in the people, but also the similarities. And so you alluded to this a little bit before, so just directly asking it. So what's your comparison or your idea of relationship building in Colombia compared to Zimbabwe or South Africa? Because relationship building really gives the impression of what a country is like based on your relationships. So what has it been like to build relationships and on different levels, obviously work relationships, personal relationships? What has it been like here in Colombia, and what is it like in South Africa and Zimbabwe?
Well, in Colombia, I'm not a Spanish speaking person. So when I first came here, I knew zero Spanish words. So that was a hindrance in the beginning, like trying to build relationships with local people unless they could speak English. But it's also, like I said, they're so friendly, and they make you feel so welcome, most of them. So in a sense, it's actually kind of easy to build relationships here with people because they're really nice, friendly, and they're very giving. And they open up their homes to you. And if you need help with anything, you know, they're available. You can't always count on them because communication here, oh my goodness, you know, in Africa, they talk about African time. Well, here they have like Costeño time. And I tell you, it's like 10 times worse than African time. And that's something that, you know, that you have to get used to. So, and coming from Africa, I would be like, okay, I'm used to African time, so I'll be fine. And I tell you what, it's completely different. It's something that you actually still need to get used to as well. So if you come from a background where, you know, everything is done in a certain way at a certain time, and like communication is like key to everything, it's going to be a little bit difficult or different here because they're way more laid back.
Well, you know, the thing is, and I'm being honest about this, I think one of the motivations that pushes the timeliness, and I think it's really a Western thing, and I don't think all bad things are Western, but I think Western ideologies and things like that specifically connect time to money, because I know I do. And so because you connect time to money, you see a loss in value of your time, so you see it as opportunities lost when things are not on time. So I think that's a reason that time thing exists, because I've heard from people from other African nations who talk about that, and it's relaxed, but it's normally because they know the people, so it's like a communal thing. So a few questions before we close out, but as far as being in Africa, because this is something that I've always thought was interesting. I'm from the United States. And I lived in New York for a really long time. And a mention you made was, you know, tourists know more about your country or your city than you do because they do the history. So, for instance, while I lived in New York, I didn't go visit like landmark places because it was just there. You just saw it every day. And I remember when I went to college and I lived in a different state, and I went back and I took a group of students back with me to tour New York. I did tourist things that I had never done before. Like I had seen them before, but I never did it. So when I did it with the students, I'm like, wow, okay. New York had like a new level to me. And so I say that, and I ask that because what are some other nations in the continent of Africa that you were maybe curious about either now or as a child, that you're like, well, I wonder what that country is like. I wonder what that country is like while you were growing up.
Well, I mean, I was lucky enough to travel to a few of the southern countries in Africa. So I've been to Mozambique, to Zambia, and Botswana, as well as Zimbabwe and South Africa. So those were all nice countries to travel to. Each have their own like differences or things like that. I wouldn't say I was really curious per se about any of the countries. It was more just I had the opportunity to travel there. I would say I'm more curious about other countries like Tanzania, for example. I really would like to go to Tanzania or Kenya and Egypt, only because I feel like they would be completely different to the southern countries. So I don't know, in my mind, but then again, I don't know so much about those countries, but that's also what makes me curious about going there.
No, that was cool because like the second part of that question was, well, what about in the world? Because you said you worked and you taught English in Korea, and so like what other countries outside of the continent have you been either visited or you've been curious about? And maybe on while I don't like the term bucket list, so I guess bucket list, or maybe something you show you show your family as you sort of progress in your life.
Well, while I was living in Korea, I was lucky enough to do quite a lot of traveling. So I traveled quite a lot in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, places like that. Then I went to China, which was great as well. I saw the Great Wall of China, which was amazing. And I was able to go to Japan. And then what was great is that I traveled to Australia as well. And I don't know if you know, but there's a lot of South Africans and Zimbabweans that actually immigrate to Australia.
Really?
So in Australia, I was in Brisbane visiting some family that I had there. And I was like, wow, this is so similar to South Africa, except it's bigger and cleaner and safer. But otherwise,
So why
so many similarities.
why did you go there? Well, so what was the reason that a lot of them have immigrated there? Do you know?
I think
Did it
it's
tell you?
because culturally, like it's very similar, but then the lifestyle there is way better. There's so many more opportunities for you if you have children, like for your children to have their like work possibilities. Like it's a better life, I guess, in a way, for some people.
No, I get that. No, I get that. I absolutely get that. And you made one mention that I thought was a really interesting and a good mention, and it says something about the perception of Americans and the world and how they're seen. So you said you were in a taxi and they thought the taxi driver thought you were American, and you're also like you mentioned you are a white African, which I think is a very powerful thing, and it speaks to just the history of the continent and the unity that can exist. So whereas some people may think that may be uncomfortable if you're different. Did you ever feel uncomfortable or different being because I don't even know sort of the demographics. Obviously, in most of the nations in Africa, it's predominantly black as far as skin color, race. And so did you ever feel like different as far as being at home in your home nations?
Growing up in Zimbabwe, no, I never felt different in any way. I mean, in my class, they were both white and black students, so it was a combination of the two. In South Africa, I didn't feel any different either. I would say I feel more different now, only because of the stereotype I think that people have on Africa, thinking that most Africans are black, but I am white. So, there's a lot of stereotypes that people have on that. But I myself am very proud to be a white African because I don't fall into the stereotype of being black African. But then also, people have that stereotype of white people being born with a silver spoon in their mouth in Africa sometimes, whereas I didn't have that either. And I think that's what makes me feel so good too, is that I break the stereotype as well.
And I mean, obviously, we're all individually special, but then you have an added dynamic of being special. So I think that's cool. And no, I do. I think that's really cool because the thing about it is, and just sort of to give a perspective from my own, is in the United States, in my opinion, I know while we don't want race to be in the forefront, it is because you have the label either African American or Black American, and then people who are
Yeah,
not one of those other Americans are just generally white people, and then every other subgroup gets kind of labeled by their ethnicity. But
yeah,
when I've left the United States, I've always just been an American. And so for me,
yeah,
I think there's sort of a refreshing thing there because then I'm just from where I am because I have the behaviors, mannerisms, and etc. So it feels like you actually have experienced the opposite of what I've experienced when you left home, and that's just to know that dynamic exists. I think says so much about what we need to learn about the world and how much we can if we're willing to connect to people. So it goes back to what you say, just travel, go to the places, and just know. And
yeah.
I
But
think
that's
that's
exactly it. I mean, like you mentioned, well, this is actually one thing that I learned as well when I went to Korea and actually met many Americans. In America, like you have your black and white colors, but in South Africa we have black, white, and colored. Now, what we call colored is mixed race between black and white. Whereas if I was an American person who is a mixture between black and white, that they are colored, that would be very offensive. Yeah, in South Africa, that's what we call a mixed race. Like we call them colored people.
wow. Wow, see, it's different because of just the history, and I think that makes a huge difference, especially since and you know, especially since you live on the coast, there's a huge African influence on the coast
Yeah.
of Colombia. So they are literally rooted from the continent of Africa, and
Yep.
so there is there's probably similarities there that you probably can just pick up on right away, which may be why you feel comfortable as well.
Maybe it could be very possible. Yes.
And so I have named my podcast Voices of My Brothers, Sisters, and People because I like to magnify the voices and whatever platform I have as much as possible of other people that I've been able to be connected to in life. And I'm appreciative of all the people I know. And I like to project them because I think me knowing them was a gift to me. And so my return to them is that I want to project them in the greatest possible positive light. And so what I do focus on is the final voice is that of the contributor of the show. And so the final voice can be about anything that you want to talk about. It could be something that's on your heart, or it could be something specifically that we focused on in the conversation. But I leave it to the guest because I think, again, it's the magnification and the love of the voice of the other person. So with that, I will say thank you to you for your contributions because I really appreciate it and I learned a lot. And I will leave the final words to you.
Thank you. Well, this has been great, and it's actually been really nice talking about where I come from. You know, your heart feel all warm and fuzzy. One thing I do want to say though is always don't always listen to what others have to say about a country because it could be like how they perceive it or how they see it or what they've heard. Obviously, we don't all have the opportunity to travel to places, but stay open-minded. I mean, when I moved to Colombia, a lot of my family members were really concerned about drugs and how people would put drugs in my suitcase and I would get arrested for drugs. Yet that is something that is not on my mind here at all. Actually, I feel safer in Colombia than I do living in South Africa. But then at the same time, I also want to say that South Africa and Zimbabwe are wonderful countries. Africa has so much to offer, and South Africa itself, you know, even though there's a lot of racial discrimination, go there with an open mind and just take in everything as you see it and experience it and just enjoy it. And don't always harp on what everyone else is experiencing or how they feel about the place or how they perceive it. Go and experience it for yourself and enjoy it, because South Africa I feel like there's so much more that South Africa can offer people, or there's so much more to experience there. Don't limit yourself.